Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second edition of Grab a Coffee, the premier podcast in the region that talks the politics, economics, and society of our region. Thank you so much to everyone that's liked, subscribed, followed, and shared our podcast with your friends. Continue to subscribe, continue to engage, and continue to let us know. Give us some very great feedback about what we're talking about. Of course, I am back again with Mr. Simon Kasiate. Mr. Simon, how was your week?
Well, my week is pretty fine, same old as you can say. As you know, there's no 2 days that are like if you live in Uganda or even the Great Lakes region.
You dress like you're going to golf after here. Are you heading?
Let's put it this way, Raymond, that it's the weekend and sometimes it's important to have some serious brewing over, bold conversations on politics, society, and critical thinking when you address the part.
Yes?
Yeah, so I try as much as possible.
No, but Simon, seriously, you last, I'm aware you were in Nairobi for the better half of a week. So how was that? How does Nairobi look like? Is it much better than Kampala? The floods less? Are the blackouts any less?
Let's put it this way, that for some people, they may say having a comparison between Nairobi and Kampala all the time about the different demographics is, if you speak to a Nairobian who possibly don't know what happens in Kampala, they tell you their city is in such a mess. And you who's coming from what you know as a mess, you say you have no idea what a mess is. And then they will quickly tell you, no, when you start making the comparisons between, some pronounce it as Kampala and Nairobi, is like two dwarfs trying to, spar up on who is
taller. Two bold men fighting
Let's put it this way, that it's been rainy for the most part in Nairobi, but you do not see what prevails here in major arterial roads as is there. Of course, there's some flooding in some places, yes, and they have some drainage concerns, but it pales in comparison to what we see here. And of course, also the level of responsiveness, one from the city authority and the government on the whole, as compared to what happens on our end. Maybe because, again, we are naturally very nice people that don't seem to complain and ask for what is duly owed to us. But that's how it is.
Maybe, but not to flog it further, but the truth of the matter is Nairobi has had almost two regenerations. First under Mwai Kibaki, where there was massive infrastructure that went in there.
And
the
I think Uhuru Kenyatta did also follow through with
the expressways going in, the widening of the roads. But also something happened with the devolution that made the Nairobi City County a more effective entity. Not effective to the best, but more effective than Kampala at the very least.
You see, I keep wondering, because I do much road work in Kampala, having been bitten by a new bug in town, which is amateur running or recreational running, just to keep...
You don't do amateur running, Simon. You do 42 kilometers. It's a full marathon.
Absolutely, and even more sometimes. On once a month, I set off from my humble abode in Buya and end up in Entebbe, and that's over 45 kilometers. But listen, Raymond, when you are in Nairobi and you're taking a leisurely jog or even a walk, you see that the government has taken care of pedestrians, motorists, cyclists, and everyone else. Here, what should be wide roads that have pedestrian walkways, you can count the number of kilometers. They are barely anything close to 50 kilometers of sideway walks across the entire Kampala metropolitan area. But even where they are, like if you go to Zambia, that area of Zambia in there, Kevina Road and others, the roads are well paved in shanty abodes, and they are pedestrian walkways. But guess what? It's on those pedestrian walkways that you have your makeshift Rolex, not just for the watch, Rolex or chapati makers. That's where you find the garages for borders. So you cannot comfortably walk along those sidewalks for pedestrians. You can't jog there. So that, for the most part, does affect our quality of living. Why is it? Because the people who think about this infrastructure development in this city do not know anything other than being driven in their official cars and not taking time to walk. But even if that were the case, what about their own kith and kin? We can be selfish, yes, but what about the greater public good? So I think there's a lot that needs to be desired in as far as infrastructure development that takes care of the different categories of people. The working class, the working class that travel by motorcycles and other bicycles, and the motorists as we know it. Now, of course, you know that KCCA, through their Kampala City Roads Rehabilitation Project, did say all the roads that are under construction will have pedestrian walkways, will have cyclists' lanes, and will have, well-paved main arteries for motorists. That is what is on paper, and I saw that on paper. How that will translate to actually being on the ground is only what we wait to see. Because I have
Much
learned...
credit, by the way, to Mr. Ramadan Gomi, because he's released money for all these road constructions that are stalled, whether it's Kira Bulindo or Kira Namugongo, Old Kampala. Money has been released to pay people who had frustrated them because of compensations.
Well, let's wait and see.
We can only hope. But I was going to tell you, surprisingly, when you mentioned running, I spent my weekend, my friend invited me, they have a home in the Pearl Marina. So I came from one gated community to another gated community to run. And I felt such a great level of dejection. There is so much more tarmac inside the Pearl Marina than there is between Shiwatu and Namugongo. I felt so dejected, like this private facility, privately run, gated community has such great facilities, but within a very terrible city called Kampala.
Well, again, the ball is in the court on those that are supposed to be making our city better, but more importantly, it's about civic demand for better services. After all, like they say, we all are stakeholders in the city. We pay our due share of the taxes, and when we don't, the ramifications are much there. So when we are able to do that, then we should be able to get what is worth of the taxes that we pay.
So let's get into the first story that we will discuss. You know, when we're in the newsroom, this stories like this normally started from hush hush. You'd hear someone saying, by the way, Batu Sasude, and you try and consult with the others. So members of parliament, it turns out now that received 100 million shillings. The money didn't come through the official parliament registrar, clerk of parliament rather. The money came rather from the chief whip's office, and the chief whip apparently also got it from the chairman NRM, who also happens to be the president. How much have you heard about this story?
Well, Raymond, like one of the newspapers did report, and the headline was "Same Old Story." The whole talk that members of parliament are being paid off their regular emoluments and packs to facilitate a certain move, or simply to kwekuba kemfufu, as the speak is not a new story. I do remember sometime in 2005, I was still in the newsroom with the National Media Group, and there was conversation around removing term limits to allow for candidates to stand ad infinitum without the 2 5-year presidential term limits. That was around 2005, ahead of 2006 election. And members of parliament, if I recall correctly at that time, were again awarded 5 million Uganda shillings. We only got to know about that when some members of parliament belonging to the NRM went to Mosa courts, as it were, to collect the money, and they did not find themselves on the roll. Why? Because they had been considered a little too rebellious, and so they were being punished for that. So the moment they didn't get their share of the money, they came out, with the usual cry and hue. We are being bribed. For us, we've not been given. So we picked up then. Same story happened in 2011, I think, when some 20 million shillings was also doled out members of parliament to promote, I think it was a Prosperity for All program that government had. We remember in 2017, when there was the whole move to remove age limits from the constitution to say someone can stand for president even after their 75th birthday, as had been capped by the constitution. I remember that time it was called Tojikwatako, meaning do not touch Article 102B of the constitution. And that money, interestingly, went through bank accounts. It was paid through bank accounts. So we saw some populist and maybe seemingly very astute members of parliament in terms of moral turpitude coming through, withdrawing the money and bringing it up in very small denominations and making such a huge show of it. So we brought back this money.
I remember Nadala Mafami with a host of 10,000 notes.
Absolutely. You remember Honorable Beatrice Sanywa, who was by then in the Forum for Democratic Change, coming through and throwing the money there and say, I can't take this money. Of course, don't ask me what happened to her later. She's a serving government minister now. So this has been recurrent. We've seen in 2022 some 40 million shillings be given out, to pass a supplementary budget. Not long ago, we also saw some more money being given to members of parliament to pass a supplementary budget, again of trillions of shillings. And now with reports coming in of 100 million shillings. The story is the same. What seems to change are the amounts. 5 million in 2005, to date in 2025, 100 million. for 500 plus members of parliament. Well, we can't say all of them. We say the NRM members of parliament did receive that. Some of their, a little more accommodative colleagues on the other side of the aisle and independent members of parliament. So nothing would shock me that this is happening. We also know how transactional our politics have become, Raymond. And so let's also not sit here and claim a higher moral ground as individuals when we are in a polity that seems to peg politics. I mean, every time you're speaking to a politician, as an ordinary citizen, you're just looking at dollar signs in their eyes. What is he or she going to give me after this conversation?
Yes.
So that members of parliament are going out there. I mean, they surprise me, Raymond. These are folks that have, by constitution, the right to adjust their emoluments.
Yeah.
Not once in the history, and never will there be a time when they will revise their emoluments downwards. It's always going upwards.
Yeah.
But that's not good enough. They still go ahead and peak. Now, this story is always wheezy and wazzy and woozy. Sorry for using kind of expressions, but nobody, even in 2005, officially says we received this money or we passed on this money. There is always a denial. That's why you're not surprised that now today, everyone is feigning ignorance. The government chief whip is saying, what?
I wasn't in town, in fact.
Like you being in town, not being in town will change a transaction. Then a deputy director of communication of the parliament will say, you're breaking news to me. What? Then a small spokesperson somewhere will say, no, but money is paid through the commission, not the speaker's residence.
Yes.
Please, like I normally read on social media. But
Simon, if I take off my moral limitations hat and wear the hat of an actual analyst, every legislative maneuver that the NRM comes into contest with other centers of power, whether those centers are Catholic Church, Buganda Kingdom, whether it's the army, that maneuver is always painful. It's painful in the sense that the NRM gets the numbers in parliament to pass whatever they want to pass, but they must then pay the consequences for doing that. So I could tell from the start of this house that one, the NRM was keen about this parish development model as the track record for development.
Without a doubt.
When you look at it as a development economics thing, it makes sense. When you look at it from a political lens, it's very, very divisive in the sense that in places like Toro, for example, the people that were the immediate recipients of PDM money were NRM mobilizers and campaigners. Now, if you're a member of parliament with 40 chairmen, and those 40 chairmen all of a sudden have money, they are immediately dangerous to you because one of them might want to take your seat. They're the ones in the constituency. They're the ones barring on your behalf. They're the ones announcing contributions that have been given on your behalf. And I could see that many NRM members were very jittery about it. They were jittery about the fact that people they considered lower in the political spectrum were
and
now
even
being
financially not doing very well.
They were being given financial means to challenge them at a time when they were at their weakest because many of these MPs had come with loans into parliament. The elections had been very, very expensive. So when the NRM came up with the legislative maneuver for the coffee bill, you could clearly see that this was going to be a hard-fought victory. Because if a member of parliament is voting yes on the coffee bill, the immediate thing is that the people who are campaigning for them in the constituency
will use that
are drumming it up and saying this person has actually voted to take away your coffee. That's what they were saying.
Absolutely.
Then the UPDF Act, this amendment to the UPDF Act, it's a very
you and I who are not military people,
yes,
if found in certain circumstances like having military wear,
yes,
should, not can be, but should be tried
in the military court martial. Yes, it's a very unpopular thing in the public, but it's a very popular move within the army. In fact, within the army, there's a solid block of soldiers who say that the only way to stop Uganda from disintegrating into smaller mutinous armies like South Sudan or Venezuela or Mexico is to have the highly punitive measures on people that hold guns.
But then wouldn't that make it an easy sell to the populace to say, look, certain things are a preserve of the army and you as a civilian have no reason having guns. But why then we see the politics coming in to say a lot of money must be pumped into that to change the mindset or even sway people towards liking members of parliament that vote in that direction?
There's very little legitimacy that the NRM has to sell anything to anyone at the moment.
Is it really that being the case, Raymond, or it is simply saying that it is a safe space to go to and claim that they have no legitimacy for them to be able to justify picking money from the consolidated fund? Because I want to believe that, okay, we recently came out from a by-election in Kawembe. If that party you're talking about had not spent the colossal sums of money, where there's still an investigation, how much was sent vis-a-vis how much was earned in terms of or votes, would there have been a difference?
They kept recycling this figure of 4 billion shillings. And I remember telling someone, if you pumped 4 billion shillings in Kawempe, the central bank would have some things on their dashboard. There would be some inflation in this city.
So anyway, without cutting you short, Raymond, I want to believe that the monetization of politics and the fact that we have members of parliament that are coming off as exceptionally needy every other passing election cycle. And this cannot be blamed on one side of the political divide. Matter of fact, those who are now with the loudest cry and hue over this money are doing so because possibly they did not get their fair share, but the fact that they all need money is there. Because even in the opposition strongholds, we've seen the attrition rate of parliament being higher than 70%, and it's going to be any less in the next election, whether you're a NUP member of parliament or an NRM member of parliament or an independent. Everyone in their backyard, including my very good friend, the leader of opposition, Honorable Joel Senyo, he has folks that are really rooting for his seat in his constituency in Nakawa East. So an extra buck to ameliorate your political woes would certainly be a welcome thing. But the question is, are we at a point where any of these members of parliament, or even the populace, can, like we Catholics do, tap their hearts and say no?
But this is, I think, for me, the thing that puzzles me. Every member of parliament, one, has churches within their constituency. Those churches are the ones that require those members of parliament to make the grandest contributions. Whether it's renovations, it's we're building a parish priest's home. So where's that money going to come from? So I think the hard question is, what is the path to development? If you think the path to development is through the state organs and state institutions, then you can forsake things like donations in the church, because then the state can come back and use its state organs to drive development. So
in other words, you are simply trying to say that rather than point our guns of fury as citizens to our members of parliament who are up there and ostensibly picking the loot from our hard-earned taxes, we may as individuals try and reduce on our begging stockhold on our politicians at different levels so that they can concentrate on why they are in parliament. For example, in this particular case, a member of parliament is not out there to come and loot from the center to bring donations for the construction of the everlastingly under construction archdeacon's house at the local church. I don't know the time when there is no...
And these are the people who are the centers of power. If you don't donate to the archdeacon, tomorrow the archdeacon, someone is going to go against you and they're going to call your opponent Simon to come and give some few words of comfort, and they won't give you the microphone. And next thing you know is you have actual internecine conflict within a smaller constituency. So I sympathize with our members of parliament, but I equally think that at the end of the day, someone within the NRM has got to ask themselves, we are an autocracy nonetheless. NRM still achieves a lot of its gains through the will force of power, coercion, manipulation. What is this autocracy leading to? At the end of the day, what kind of autocracy are we leading? Because now, together with the autocracy, you're using the carrot, which is using state money to try and buy out people. And it's not working. It's really not working. People increasingly think the NRM is more corrupt and more inefficient, more inept.
Raymond, we see what we're seated here and talking about is stuff that our listeners and the grand populace of Uganda actually know. Some may even experience it with a deeper pain to their hearts and their livelihoods than you and I do. I think what, in 1 minute, as we conclude on this subject matter, we can try to, from where we sit, What do you think would be the solution in all this? That if, for example, you have an unpopular position that needs to be etched in our constitution, that you have got an unpopular trade-off of, whether government should spend money building a private hospital and all that. Like when you have it on the table, how do we get to see the light of day without sinking the country further into another financial doldrum? I think that's the solution we should be looking at. What's done in other countries? You just returned from Oxford, for example, and I'm sure the House of Commons sometimes finds itself in that kind of situation.
That's not the best example to rely on at all. But so one is understand the kind of society that we live in. We are 45 million people. 20 million of us are capable of working, or at least that's what UBO says. Of the 20 million capable of working, 14 million actually have jobs. Most of those 14 million are in subsistence agriculture and what. Only 1.7 million of us pay taxes. And yet the state can only survive based on taxes. The state doesn't survive on your capacity to work. It survives on your capacity to bring in taxes. So there's very little tax revenue available to the state for the many demands that people are making. All the 45 million want health, they want education, they want security.
But
and those things,
a fraction of those are actually...
Only 1.7 of those are paying. And even those 1.7, they are going through the headache. The roads have broken down, the hospitals are not the kind they admire, the public schooling system has broken down. So you've got to get to a point where you ask, what is the purpose of being in leadership? In Rwanda, for example, for the RPF knows that it's a coalition that keeps Rwanda together. So you have members of competing parties inside of government. So the Speaker of Parliament will come from a different party. The Vice President in some times will come from a different party. The Prime Minister will be a member of the RPF. Members of the RPF themselves will have their own demands on the RPF that they want the RPF to bring to light. And everyone then negotiates their interests within the state. And once the interests are coalesced at the state level, they move forward using that. In Kenya, it's the other way around. In Kenya, everyone gets their tribe gets their interests, and then they bring those interests to the ballot, and they compete using the ballot. So if you have the second biggest tribe, for example, you can force government's hand and say, we want these contracts to go to us. We want this money to go to us. So Kenya reached a point where they said, maybe the best part is to devolve this government. If you come from Siaya, stay there. Don't come to Nairobi. Collect your tax revenue there. Use your tax revenue. Just send a fraction of it to the central government. Maybe that's what we need to be looking at right now. Why?
Do you remember a word called decentralization in relation to Uganda's government structure?
I do.
Do you remember a word called broad-based government?
Yes. Unfortunately,
so you understand that what you described in Rwanda and what you just described in Kenya has actually happened here before.
No. And here we are decentralizing through members of parliament. So when Simon has a problem, we will carve out a constituency for Simon and give him 20 million shillings every month and say, every problem from funerals, health, education falls on you, the member of parliament.
Well, it's happening in Rwanda. I think so you have an extra constituency for the likes of me.
Yes. So that's. I think that's where we need to get to a point where people realize this thing is not working, and it's really not working, because if you're spending a lot of your tax revenue on bribing, paying back debt on interest, using that debt to try and do small development projects where people are, you're constructing a road for 1.5 billion. Almost 700 of that is just paying people money for them being in the right of way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So those things, I complain a lot about the Namugongo-Kira road, but the reason that road is not moving is because some people have decided that they must be compensated before the road moves on. And these are people who've built in the road reserve.
Knowingly.
And
the government agency that is supposed to evict them is not evicting them. They also
because they are political heavyweights.
No, but also because they are conniving with them to up their premium on their compensation figure. Because if you ask anyone that has been in a place that the road needs to pass, they have seen a technocrat coming in from a government agency saying, no, okay, your actual compensation value is 1 shilling, but you're going to say it is 2 shillings. When we compensate you the 2 shillings, please bring back my half a shilling, or whatever amount it is. So we are, it's the thread of low moral turpitude. that weaves through all of us. And I think as we really break out from this conversation, Raymond, it is not a case of pointing a finger at the politicians, at our leaders. Yes, of course, and Joe always used to argue on the program sometime back when we were on TV, that it falls and rises on leadership. But I always told him that leadership you're talking about is a byproduct of who we are as a polity. We get the leaders that resemble us. Our leaders are not made out of khaki and we are made out of jean material. We are all the same, except that for them, they are refined. Now, Raymond, when you find yourself in a situation like the one that we are in Uganda, I always want to come down to an individual, you and I. Where can you and I do in the grand scheme of things?
I don't know. We're doing what we can. We are recording Grab a Coffee.
But you talked about Rwanda, and we're getting into a period in Rwanda which they call Kwibuka, which is the remembrance of the unfortunate events that happened in 1993 into 1994.
The genocide against the
genocide against the Tutsis. And we saw President Kagame in his characteristic style making his speech to the nation, and in there he told the international community, I think in what was in his typical style, and said, we as Rwandans, and I as the president of Rwanda, have, my municipal concerns and problems that I'm dealing with. And it's not in your place to tell me how I'm going to deal with them, because you too have your own municipal concerns. And if you think that my concerns as a Rwandan or the Rwandan leadership are your concerns when you're not Rwandan, you may as well hit the highway to hell.
Go to hell. In
that
very
comes
clear
at
terms.
the heels of him cutting diplomatic ties with
Belgium. Yes.
And this is not the first time he has showed anyone, I don't say the middle finger, but clearly that's what it is. If I may speak figuratively, he's done that to the French and the others. What does that say about President Kagame as a man? Has he reached a point where he doesn't really care what external pressures may befall him as an individual and Rwanda as a polity, or it is him being indeed the embodiment of true leadership, where you say, you know what, this is my forte and I'm going to do it no matter what?
I think it's complex to speculate on this one, but I would say two things. Rwanda has come under increasing diplomatic pressure over what's happening in the Eastern DRC. And justifiably so, Rwanda has been asking, if there's a problem in the Eastern DRC, why is that diplomatic pressure not being applied to the government in the DRC? Because there's a government there is a president there called Tshisekedi. He has an army at his disposal. He has massive revenues at his disposal. He controls more than 90% of all the minerals that come out of the DRC. So the principal concern should be his. Rwanda's concern with the Eastern DRC is the same concern that Uganda has, that, this place is insecure. It has people who operate from here that are a security threat to us. And because they're a security threat to us, they need to be responded to. Now, the DRC government does not have capacity to deal with the insecure elements in the Eastern DRC. As a result, the question is, how do you deal with them? Do you invite your more stronger neighbors to come in and do the work, the same way the UPDF is doing with ADF? Rwanda had been invited at the start of Tshisekedi's presidency to get in there, and then that invitation was revoked. Do you invite Angola, for example, to come and deal with the rebels inside the Eastern DRC? Or do you actually man up as the DRC government and say, okay, we are now going to start take responsibility? And one of the ways of taking responsibility is we will carry out an operation against these elements that you say are hostile elements to you. Now, I tell people, there is the world the way we want to see it, and there is the world as it is. The world as it is just simply that Goma is close to Kigali. And by virtue of Goma being close to Kigali, it falls within the sphere of influence of Kigali. Goma is so far away from Kinshasa, Simon, that you can fly from here to Juba, have a coffee with Mr. Salva Kiir for the next 1 hour, and fly back before someone leaves Goma and gets to Kinshasa. And that just expands in distance, the expanse in territory.
Certain variables are not being considered here.
Yes.
Using the same aircraft.
Yes, but those are the concerns now.
Yes.
Now, the international community has struggled to interpret this. Why are they struggling to interpret this? Because for the international community, Africa is a recipient of the liberal order. We are not supposed to say anything about that liberal order. The borders between Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC were demarcated in Berlin. And during the demarcation, some of the concerns were trivial. For example, there are people who would say, but the mountain is on that side of the border. And they say, okay, as a birthday gift, we have moved the mountain to this side of the border.
Well, let's not go so much into that discussion, Raymond, because again, people want to extend the boundaries of Uganda right after Eldoret and all that. But you're very right.
Yes, so they are working within those boundaries. And you could tell President Kagame's speech was about that. It was really about the fact that we have received an order which we are unhappy with, because that order has led to insecure elements operating from separate territory that would put us in an internationally difficult place to deal with. But whilst we deal with it, there's an African Union mechanism, there is an East African Community mechanism.
The Southern Africa mechanism.
Rwanda has its own mechanism of dealing with it. And Rwanda's own mechanism needs to be respected. That's, I think, the message that Rwanda's been trying to cut through. And that's been very hard for people to understand.
And but you see, as all that happens, and as everyone, drums up whichever side of the coin they want to look at it, we still see Visit Rwanda as a campaign, folks coming in to enjoy the tranquility of Rwanda, at least from a touristic perspective. And that's why I want sometimes to draw the parallels with what happens here. I mean, there's no doubt Rwanda is always in the eye of the storm for one thing or another. It's internal domestic political contestations where the allegations of opponents of President Kagame not being able to do what they should be doing politically, or he's having a conflict with another neighbor, either to the north or to the south. But as that still happens, you get to see Visit Rwanda, you get to see endorsements, you get to see all this infrastructure being, built inside Rwanda, you get to see the economy really progressing in a manner that one would wonder how it does in the midst of all this. How is he able to eclipse some of these negative, difficult circumstances against the development of the country remaining on a steady trajectory?
I think Rwanda's policy to deal with the world is that it will forever remain a contention of proportions. There's a proportion of people who wish away Rwanda, and Rwanda knows that. There's a proportion of people who wish well for Rwanda, and Rwanda knows that. And they've found the tricky balance on how to deal with all of this. Remember, this is the Remembrance Week, so it's a perfect time to remember. The entire international community abandoned Rwanda during the genocide against the Tutsi. All of them. The French pulled out, the Belgians pulled out. In fact, they were contributing even money towards the genocide itself. The Germans pulled out. The Catholic Church pulled out. It took keen intervention of the RPF with Uganda to say this thing can be stopped.
Like they say, the genocide did not stop.
Yes.
The genocidaires were stopped.
They were stopped, yes.
Otherwise, they would have continued with their wanton killing.
Exactly. And when they were stopped, they fled into the Eastern DRC, and they were being armed and rearmed there by countries which I'm not sure we should mention now. But so that's the problem, that this is history in the making. It's still alive, and people still notice it. So Rwandans alive today would question, for example, if Congolese Tutsis are being slaughtered in the DRC, what is to stop the people doing that slaughter from crossing the border and coming to Rwanda? If we're not strong,
they exterminate those ones.
If we're not strong and powerful, if Rwanda wasn't strong and powerful, what would be the outcome? And so part of that, the communication of Rwanda's capacities, is to deter the people that would act against it.
We're looking at another case of international bullying happening to our neighbors to the north. And it's a very interesting story that I don't know what would have happened if it was in the case of Rwanda. That you find the US, Trump and his maneuvers lately, deports to South Sudan a
Congolese national.
a man with a South Sudan passport,
yes,
and South Sudan name, a quintessential name. Their names that are, the guy is called Garang,
yes,
one of his names. But on arrival in Juba, the South Sudan authorities question the man and find the man has an interesting name. He could actually even have been Ugandan. He's called Makula Chintu. And South Sudan, for whatever its follies and, incapacities, diplomatically writes to the US and say, look, sends back this guy and says, this is not a South Sudanese citizen, he's actually a Congolese citizen, and we've processed him and realized, no, we sent him back to sender. And as a result of that, US unilaterally revokes all US visas to South Sudan nationals that have received them, and some that were already in the US, and they're telling them, look, you better go back. For one individual who you are even not 100% sure is Sudanese, and you are bullying an entire nation. Later on being the fact that it's the youngest nation on earth. Like, to what extent can US bullying?
So that's the thing that, the US has been the global hegemon for quite some time. But the way international relations works is that there's no policeman. If you have more power than your neighbor, you can engage in activity that communicates to them that I have more power than you. If your neighbor has equal power, for example, today, Salva Kiir is well within his right to revoke all South Sudanese visas.
But you see, the Rome statute that governs how countries deal with each other diplomatically really does talk about reciprocity and the fact that you cannot pull out a sledgehammer to kill a fly. Yes. Worse still, if the fly is patched on someone's scrotum. Like, clearly, even when you feel it using
we are living in interesting times. And part of those interesting times is to understand that, one, the US is in a competition of influence in the world. And that competition is just being increased by Donald Trump. He's hit all the world with tariffs. Those tariffs have started operating. We've seen global markets shake up. Whether it works in favor of the US or not is another matter altogether. We've seen China make maneuvers since those tariffs were hit by saying, okay, countries that have been hit by excess tariffs, you can get Chinese goods. We can find logistical ways to supply those goods. So you're in a competition for power. The competition we're still lucky is economic. It's not yet military. If it were military, then we would be speaking a whole different language altogether. But the world has come from... People would be shocked about this, that if you go back to 1945, the US and Russia were fighting on one side against, of all people, the Germans, So times do change, and you can see now the EU is getting closer to China than it was before. Japan, which was a traditional ally of the US, has started getting even closer to the EU because they understand this man is unpredictable. He will wake up in the morning, he'll take a decision. That decision will have immense consequences on you and on your life. So you need stable, reliable, and traditional partners. And you can construct
that go beyond 4 years.
Yes, you can construct them. And I don't know if many people within the US understand what's happening, that the communication of US power is drawing more countries to the attention of, why have we actually never addressed this power imbalance?
No, but you see, Raymond, what you talk about is US in competition for their hegemonic position across the globe. But you see, when they get down to clobbering a country like South Sudan over one case of a deported non-citizen, it's more like you and I are in a tough battle for who's possibly the greatest show moderator. And one of us chooses to want to show who is the greatest show moderator on someone that is doing a little, like how you see these massacre kids that do mimic talk shows and are trying to show them who boss is. Like, surely, why would the US really come out so hard on a country like South Sudan, knowing exactly many of the folks that have, those visas to the US and all that are either there to get, more specialized medical treatment, those who can afford it, getting a decent education they don't have in their own country, fleeing political rife as we see it in their country, generally to keep them in South Sudan and blockade them in there from, going to live the American dream, whatever it is. Well, it's in the right of the US to determine who comes into their borders, yes. But of all countries, South Sudan?
Yes, but Simon, many white male voters who make up the bulk of the supporters of Donald Trump believe that people who've come from other countries into the US have taken up their jobs. Whether they would be doing those jobs or not is a secondary matter. Many of those people believe that the reason the US is not progressing is because the entire world is, quote unquote, leeching off the US. that the US is producing this grand economy and the rest of you are just leeching off of it. And Donald Trump has sort of made those fissures first by slapping countries with tariffs to say, if you have a trade imbalance with us, we will slap you with tariffs so that we can address that trade imbalance. To the undoing of foreign aid, where Donald Trump said, look, we're not going to send foreign aid to countries. We're going to use that money inside of the US. They've done this thing called Dodge with Elon Musk, where they've been trying to cut down the civil service so that they make it more responsive to the needs of the Americans. Whether that will pay off is a secondary matter. What they're doing is communicating to the voters of Donald Trump that we promised that we would fight for, quote unquote, the American, and we're fighting for the American. Now, for you and I, it would not make sense that they've sent a South Sudanese down. But for a white man in Illinois right now that they've deported a South Sudan, it's like, oh, finally. People are being sent away, so now we will get jobs. Whether they will get jobs or another is another matter altogether.
Raymond, last week when we began this conversation, trying to brew some bold conversations on politics, society and critical thinking, the big elephant in the room was the handover of power from Umeme to UEDCL.
Light.
And of course, there was all this skepticism that said, okay, fine. And indeed, we saw some, birth pangs with the fact that the rains were also coming in. And of course, there's something about to rain and the availability of steady supply of electricity. But 1 into 2 weeks of this, what's your assessment of the services so far rendered to you by the Uganda Electricity Distribution Company?
I don't send the message that power can be handed over and things go on peacefully after that. Yeah, but I've seen, of course, UEDCL has been making the bed as they go along. The first and most immediate concern upon the handover was, of course, the immediate panic. Who do we pay money to? And they addressed that by creating a new payment platform on all these social and telecom networks, UEDCL Lite. There was a secondary concern on customer care. Who do we complain to when our power goes off?
Whether Umeme had patented the customer care numbers.
Yes.
So
and we now see that UEDCL has started to absorb that and take that on. Of course, there have been some blackouts in many places. People have complained about those blackouts.
That will possibly still have taken place even if it were
even if it were Umeme. The thing that we spoke about last week was that you need to make grand investments into the power distribution network. And UEDCL hasn't yet made those grand investments. But we are still within the 30-day window in which the fight between Umeme and UEDCL might end up in a court of law or might end up into an arbitration. So we're also still looking forward to that. The chairman of Umeme, Patrick Pitaturi, has said quite openly that, yes, they received money, but they're not happy with the sum total that they received, which is 127 or $118 million. So they're expecting more money, and I don't see government of Uganda giving them any more money, except through an arbitrated process. So I would say that I don't come from a very bad place. So my power has been on constantly and consistently, with the exception of, one day when we lost power for, 1 hour. But other than that, our power has been stable. But I have friends who've lost power for 2 days, 3 days, and these are in Chambogo, for example.
And that's when you give them that famous message, Musenguke. Well, but let's also not forget, Raymond, that, as we analyze the current state of affairs of that handover of power, let's not forget that there was the reverse handover of power 20 years ago when indeed UEDCL, which was Uganda Electricity Board, as an offshoot of Uganda Electricity Board, then handed over to Umeme and the like. And there were folks that were present at that time, holding huge technical positions and were participatory in the conversations around that. And people are still alive today.
I don't know if we should say that, we have reached out to these people.
We did.
And we might bring them on the podcast.
And that's why I'm also bringing this up, to challenge them to the fact that, look, if you were Mr. Kalisa Kabagambe and you retired as the permanent secretary of Ministry of Energy, but at the time, 20 years ago when the concession was put in place, you were a top technocrat in the Ministry of Energy, you are still alive, of sound mind, and you're seated somewhere in blissful retirement, I think you owe it to this country to come and just share with us the experience of what informed that decision. If you are John Berry, And you were the head of Umeme at the time, the conglomerate between CDC and ESCOM that became Umeme. And now you're still in Uganda, and you are the top honcho at Bujagali Electricity Limited, and you're also belonging to certain, electricity infrastructure outfit under engineer Badru Chigundu. And you are live in Uganda. I think John Berry ought to come to the program and have a conversation with
We
him.
are ready to take the cameras, in fact, to Jagal itself.
Absolutely. So, there is Honorable Simon Dujang. He was the managing director of Uganda Electricity Board. He was one of the, he lost his powers to generation, transmission, and distribution. But he was the biggest guy at the time of the unbundling. He did not stop there. He became a politician, then recently retired as a Minister of State at the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development in charge of electricity. And here as Minister has seen the development of such huge infrastructure like Karuma and Isimba. And he's alive, and he's available, and he's of sound mind. That's the man we should also challenge to say, come and let's grab a coffee. Does it really hurt if those three individuals I just mentioned, just out of my hand? In other words, what I'm trying to say, Raymond, about this grabbing a coffee, it's not so much about you and I grabbing a coffee and talking about from our experiences and our analytical skills. But like we did promise our multitude of listeners and viewers, that we intend, for the most part, to bring to them substantiated conversations with the people that really were at the center of the issues that we had decision making. And even if those three gentlemen, and I have a lot of respect for them, Mr. Kalisa Kabagambe, John Berry, and Honorable Simon Dujang, they may not necessarily come to the program, but give us audience, we grab a coffee with them, maybe off camera, and we have a conversation, and then we can bring this and enrich our ability to analyze these issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to us on Grab a Coffee. This has been our second edition of the podcast. Please continue to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends. And we will get back to you every Friday. We will be dropping at 9 a.m. So just remain tuned. We will come to you everywhere you get your podcasts from.